This tragic story involves four peoples: Emily Parker, a devoted housewife and mother of two; David Parker, Emily's husband, a successful real estate agent; James Rivers, a charming and enigmatic bartender; Claire Reynolds, a sharp-minded and no-nonsense detective. Emily Parker stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her fingertips tracing the delicate lines forming around her eyes. She was 36, still young by most standards, but the years of routine and unspoken resentment were beginning to show. Married for 15 years to David, a man who had once made her heart race, Emily now felt like a ghost in her own home. Their conversations had dwindled to mundane exchanges about bills, groceries, and their children's school activities. The spark that had once lit up their lives had long since flickered out, replaced by a cold, silent detachment. The loneliness gnawed at her, more insidious with each passing day. She had tried to fill the void: volunteer work, book clubs, yoga classes, but nothing seemed to ease the growing emptiness. That was until she met James Rivers. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when she first walked into the dimly lit pub on the corner of Main Street. She hadn't intended to go inside. She was simply avoiding the rain, taking shelter under the awning. But the warmth and low hum of conversation had drawn her in, offering an escape from the dreary monotony of her life. James had been behind the bar, polishing a glass with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He was tall, with a rugged charm that immediately caught her eye. Brown hair tousled just enough to be attractive, a 5 o'clock shadow that hinted at a carefree life, and eyes that sparkled with an energy she hadn't seen in years. "Whiskey neat?" he had asked, flashing her a smile that sent a thrill down her spine. Emily had blushed, shaking her head. "Just a glass of wine, please." From that first encounter, something shifted inside her. James had a way of making her feel seen, of drawing out the parts of herself she had long buried. He listened, genuinely interested in her thoughts, her feelings, her dreams, things David no longer asked about. Their conversations grew more intimate with each visit, the chemistry between them undeniable. Soon, those harmless talks over drinks morphed into something far more dangerous. What began as a simple flirtation quickly escalated into a full-blown affair. For Emily, it was like waking up from a long, dreamless sleep. James made her feel alive again, desired, and she was willing to overlook the fact that he was 10 years younger and lived a life vastly different from her own. The thrill of sneaking around, the stolen moments together, only intensified the attraction. But deep down, Emily knew it couldn't last. She was a married woman, after all, with children who depended on her. Still, she couldn't bring herself to end it. Not yet. David, absorbed in his work, noticed the changes in his wife but chose to ignore them. The late nights, the unexplained absences, he attributed them to her finding new hobbies or reconnecting with old friends. He was too busy closing deals, making money, and maintaining their lifestyle to probe any deeper. And perhaps, on some level, he preferred it that way. The truth was, David was having an affair of his own, with a colleague at the real estate firm. A secret he guarded with the same care as Emily did hers. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and it wasn't long before their delicate balance of deception began to crumble. It was a warm, summer evening when it all started to fall apart. Emily was at the pub with James, tucked away in a corner booth, their hands intertwined beneath the table. They were discussing their plans for the weekend, a rare getaway they had managed to arrange under the pretense of a solo trip for Emily. The excitement was palpable, the anticipation electric. But as the night wore on, the alcohol loosened their tongues, and they began to speak of things they had previously kept hidden. "I wish we didn't have to sneak around like this," Emily whispered, resting her head on James's shoulder. "I wish we could just be together, out in the open." James sighed, running his fingers through her hair. "I know, Em, but leaving your husband, it's not that simple, is it?" She hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "No, it's not. David, he's not a bad man. He's just distant." And I think he's having an affair, too." James's expression darkened. "You're sure?" Emily nodded slowly. "I've seen the signs. Late-night meetings, unexplained business trips. I don't have proof, but I know." James leaned back, a coldness creeping into his voice. "So why stay? Why not leave him and be with me?" Emily looked away, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. "Because of the kids, and because I'm scared. What if it's a mistake? What if you change your mind about me?" James grabbed her hand, his grip firm. "I'm not going to change my mind, Emily. I love you. But we can't keep doing this. You have to decide." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily wanted to say yes, to throw caution to the wind and run away with him. But the fear held her back. She was trapped between the life she knew and the life she wanted, paralyzed by the consequences of either choice. The tension between them grew over the next few days, and when the weekend of their planned getaway arrived, Emily still hadn't made a decision. James was growing impatient, his affection for her beginning to sour into frustration. The thought of losing her, of returning to his lonely, aimless existence, filled him with dread. He wasn't going to let her slip away, not without a fight. On the day of their departure, Emily packed her suitcase with trembling hands, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She left a note for David, explaining that she needed some time to think, to clear her head. It was a vague excuse, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. As she walked out of the house, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. She was about to cross a line she could never uncross. They met at a small, secluded cabin on the outskirts of town, a place James had rented for the weekend. The isolation was both thrilling and terrifying, a reminder of how far they had gone. The first night was everything Emily had hoped for, romantic, passionate, and full of whispered promises. But as the second day dawned, the reality of their situation began to sink in. James was restless, pacing the cabin with a growing sense of unease. "Have you told him?" he asked, breaking the silence. Emily looked up from the book she was pretending to read. "Told who what?" "David. Have you told him you're leaving?" She shook her head, her stomach nodding. "Number I can't just do that. It's not that simple." James's expression hardened. "It is that simple, Emily. You either want to be with me, or you don't." She set the book aside, her voice trembling. "Of course I want to be with you, but it's complicated. I can't just walk away from my life." He crossed the room in a few quick strides, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Then what are we doing here? Why did you come if you're not ready to make a choice?" Tears welled in her eyes as she tried to pull away. "I don't know. I'm scared, James. Scared of what happens next. Scared of what I'm losing." James's grip tightened, his frustration boiling over. "And what about me? Don't I matter? Or am I just a fling to you, something to make you feel better about your boring life?" The words cut deep, and Emily recoiled as if struck. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I love you, but I can't just throw everything away." The argument escalated, voices raised, tempers flaring. The idyllic weekend they had planned was rapidly disintegrating into a nightmare. And then, in a moment of blind rage, James did something neither of them could take back. He grabbed the empty wine bottle from the table and threw it against the wall, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The sound was deafening, but it wasn't enough to quell his anger. He turned on Emily, his eyes wild with desperation. "You don't get to leave me, Emily. Not after everything we've been through." Fear surged through her as she backed away, her heart racing. "James, stop. Please, let's just talk about this." But there was no reasoning with him now. He was a man possessed, his love twisted into something dark and dangerous. Before she could react, he lunged at her, his hands closing around her throat. The shock of the attack paralyzed her, and by the time she began to fight back, it was too late. The struggle was brief, brutal, and when it was over, Emily lay motionless on the floor, her life snuffed out in a moment of uncontrollable fury. James stumbled back, staring in horror at what he had done. The reality of his actions hit him like a wave, crashing over him and leaving him gasping for air. He had killed the woman he loved, the one person who had given his life meaning. For a long moment he stood frozen, unable to process the enormity of what had just happened. His hands trembled, still clutching at the air where Emily's throat had been. The silence in the cabin was deafening, the only sound his ragged breathing as he tried to comprehend the irreversible act he had committed. Panic set in as the weight of his crime began to suffocate him. What had he done? How could he fix this? He couldn't. There was no way to undo the horror of that moment. The love that had once filled the room now lay shattered, just like the broken bottle on the floor. He had destroyed everything, and there was no going back. James staggered to the door, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. He had to leave, had to get as far away as possible before anyone found out what had happened. But even as he fumbled for the doorknob, the reality of the situation hit him again. There was no escape. He couldn't just walk away from this. There would be consequences, and they would catch up with him sooner or later. He looked back at Emily's lifeless body, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. The woman he had loved, who had been his everything just moments before, now lay cold and still, a testament to his rage and failure. He had to think, had to figure out what to do next. The only thing that came to mind was covering it up, hiding the evidence, pretending it never happened. In a state of numb shock, James set about cleaning up the scene. He grabbed a towel from the bathroom and wiped down everything he had touched. He wrapped Emily's body in a sheet, trying to ignore the sickening feeling that came with handling her like an object. Every movement felt surreal, as if he were watching someone else's hands perform these terrible tasks. But there was no one else, only him and the mess he had made. As he worked, his mind kept racing, trying to piece together a plan. He couldn't stay at the cabin. Someone would eventually come looking for Emily, and if they found her here, he would be the prime suspect. He needed to move her body, dispose of it somewhere far away where no one would find it. But where? And how could he ensure no one would connect him to the crime? The hours dragged by as James methodically went about his grim work. He loaded Emily's body into the trunk of his car, driving through the night with no clear destination in mind. He knew he needed to find a remote spot, somewhere isolated where no one would think to look. The guilt gnawed at him with every mile, but he shoved it down, focusing on the task at hand. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, he found a deserted stretch of road leading into the woods. It was the kind of place where people rarely ventured, a perfect location for hiding something that was never meant to be found. He drove as far as the dirt path would take him, then got out and carried Emily's body deep into the woods. As he dug a shallow grave, the reality of what he was doing crashed over him in waves. This was the woman he had claimed to love, and now he was burying her like a piece of trash. The tears came unbidden, streaming down his face as he worked, but it was too late for remorse. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. When the grave was filled in and the ground smoothed over as best he could manage, James stumbled back to his car. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but he couldn't stop now. There was still evidence to dispose of. The car, the bloody towel, the wine bottle fragments. Everything had to go if he had any hope of escaping suspicion. For the next few days, James lived in a daze, going through the motions of normal life while trying to stay one step ahead of the inevitable investigation. He sold his car, using the cash to buy an old, nondescript vehicle with no ties to him. He burned the towel and any other items that might connect him to the crime, scattering the ashes in a river far from town. But no matter how carefully he covered his tracks, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all for nothing, that eventually the truth would catch up to him. And it did, sooner than he expected. Emily's disappearance didn't go unnoticed. When she failed to return home, David's concern turned to alarm. He tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. After a day without any word, he contacted the police, filing a missing persons report. The local authorities took the case seriously, given the unusual circumstances, and soon Detective Claire Reynolds was assigned to the investigation. Detective Reynolds was known for her sharp instincts and dogged determination. She had solved many difficult cases in her career, earning a reputation as someone who didn't give up until she found the truth. From the moment she took on Emily's case, she knew something was off. The details of the woman's life, her recent change in behavior, her strained marriage, suggested that this was no ordinary disappearance. Reynolds began her investigation by interviewing David, who was understandably distraught. He insisted that Emily had simply gone on a weekend trip to clear her head, but when pressed, he admitted that their marriage hadn't been in a good place for a while. The detective noted the tension in his voice, the way he avoided eye contact whenever the subject of their relationship came up. It was clear there was more to the story, but whether it involved Emily's disappearance was still unclear. She also spoke with friends and neighbors, piecing together a picture of Emily's life. The more she learned, the more she became convinced that Emily had been involved with someone else, someone who might have a motive to harm her. The whispers about a possible affair were hard to ignore, especially when she discovered that Emily had been spending a lot of time at a local pub. It didn't take long for Reynolds to track down James Rivers. When she first interviewed him, he was polite and cooperative, but something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in her mind. He was too calm, too rehearsed in his answers. She asked him about his relationship with Emily, and while he admitted they had been friends, he denied anything more. But Reynolds wasn't convinced. As the investigation progressed, small inconsistencies began to emerge. James's alibi for the weekend Emily disappeared was shaky at best, and there were gaps in his story that he couldn't adequately explain. Reynolds also noticed his behavior, how he seemed on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to catch him in a lie. The breakthrough came when the detective decided to revisit the pub, this time digging deeper into its security footage. What she found was damning. A video from the night before Emily's disappearance showing her and James leaving the pub together, looking far too intimate to be just friends. Reynolds now had a lead, a solid connection between the two, one that pointed to James as a person of interest. With this new evidence in hand, she brought James in for questioning again. This time, her approach was different, more direct, less friendly. She laid out what she knew, watching his reaction carefully. The change in his demeanor was immediate. His calm exterior cracked, giving way to panic. He tried to deflect, to downplay the relationship, but Reynolds wasn't having it. The pressure mounted as she pressed him further, bringing up the inconsistencies in his story, the gaps in his timeline. James's anxiety grew, his responses becoming more erratic. He knew he was cornered, and the weight of what he had done was crushing him. Finally, in a moment of desperation, James broke down and confessed. He told Reynolds everything, how the affair had spiraled out of control, how his love for Emily had turned to jealousy and rage, and how, in a moment of madness, he had taken her life. The relief of unburdening himself was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by the cold reality of what awaited him. A life behind bars, haunted by the memory of the woman he had destroyed. Detective Reynolds listened to his confession with a heavy heart. She had seen this before, the way love could twist into something dark and destructive. But knowing the pattern didn't make it any easier. She thought of Emily, a woman who had been trapped in an unhappy marriage, searching for something more, only to find a tragic end. There were no winners in this story, only broken lives and shattered dreams. When the news of James's arrest broke, it sent shockwaves through the community. Emily's disappearance had already sparked concern, but the revelation of her affair and subsequent murder turned it into a full-blown scandal. People who had once admired the Parker family now whispered about them in hushed tones, their sympathy for David quickly turning to judgment. David himself was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. The affair, the murder, the betrayal, it was all too much to bear. He had lost his wife, not just to another man, but to a violent, senseless act that had torn his family apart. The guilt gnawed at him, even though he wasn't the one.